Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. With 2019 nearing midpoint, predictions regarding the fragile situation vis-à-vis the Gaza Strip have yet to materialize. Earlier, there were indications of either a major Israeli military incursion into the Hamas-controlled Palestinian enclave or a de-facto arrangement between the parties which sought to realize a mutually invested cessation of hostilities. Unexpectedly, neither scenario took hold. To discuss the latest developments pertaining to the Israel-Gaza challenge, we're joined here in the studio by Lieutenant Colonel in Reserve Reuven Ben-Shalom, who is a cross-cultural strategist and associate at the International Institute for Counterterrorism. Welcome. I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Brigadier General in Reserve Yossi Kuperwasser, who is a project director on Middle East developments at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Welcome.
Thank you.
Mr. Oren, give us a broader update on the latest developments pertaining to the Gaza Strip.
It's very hot down there. It's the western part of Israel, southwestern, called the Negev. And it's hot there not only weather-wise, but also because the fields are being burned by the Palestinians. So it's awkward to talk about such a hot place in freezing terms. But actually the situation is frozen and has been for the last several months, except for some peaks of escalation because of the domestic political situation in Israel. There is no decision-making mechanism in Israel to speak of. The government, of course, has been waiting the results of the elections, and then we are going to hold a new round of elections on September the 17th. So the Palestinians don't really have a partner in Israel. Usually it's the other way around. Israelis complain that there is no partner on the Palestinian side. So even if there has been an Israeli prime minister and an Israeli cabinet willing to either sign or agree to a de facto arrangement with Hamas, there is no one to sign for Israel right now. And it seems as if no one is really keen on a major operation either, because the repercussions are unpredictable and one doesn't go into an election with something one cannot predict the end of.
Colonel Ben-Shalom, last year, before the abundantly rainy season that we just had this winter, the situation in southern Israel was horrifying. Every field was burnt, miles and miles long of black groves, and it was really heartbreaking to see that. After this winter, thankfully, the situation improved, where we saw again a lot of green, and the situation seemed a lot better for the future. But now again, even though there is somewhat of an arrangement behind the scenes, the Palestinian Islamists are once again using incendiary kites and balloons to target the Israeli home front, agricultural fields. Israeli civilians are devastated with millions of losses in capital funds, obviously. To what end is this going to continue?
For a very long time, unfortunately. And I think we're going to have a tough summer with dry fields, and we're going to have more fires. Now, it's very complicated for me as an Israeli to speak about it, and I'll explain why. Every field that burns is a tragedy for the farmers that grew that wheat. Every incendiary balloon like that, of course, is a terror attack. But when we look at the broader picture, what did Hamas achieve? What are they achieving? Nothing. I think the big picture now is the frustration of Hamas leadership in Gaza. They are a failed leadership. They have responsibility for the strip that they rule. They assumed responsibility first by elections, then by force, but now they are the rulers of Gaza. And they are failing miserably, and I think their people are telling them that they're failing miserably, telling them more and more overtly, by the way. And I think there's a big frustration there. Now, Israel isn't their main problem. Don't forget they have Egypt that clamped down on them very hard and are the only negotiator in the region. Tough opposition to Hamas by Palestinian Islamic Jihad inside the Strip and other elements. That means even when Hamas does want to maintain some kind of quiet with us, they want to control the flames with us, they are challenged inward by shooting rockets. Then they have to sort of give excuses to us that it was by mistake. They are in a completely challenging situation. So, and I say it's difficult because, we're going to have a tough summer, but on the bottom line is that they're losing and gaining nothing. I think the big frustration is that every attempt they tried to make, we foiled it. Underground, over the air, everything was foiled. Their march of return, a year long of demonstrations, trying to bring hundreds of thousands, one big failure. Now, I'm sorry to say this, as it sounds like Israeli propaganda. I think that's the balance, and I think that's the problem here. And now the question is, if I, as an Israeli, want them to be less frustrated, what can I do about that? That's another question.
Nevertheless, the frustration of the farmers is mounting. General Kuperwasser, are Israeli civilians of southern Israel expected to persevere and just expect the current status quo, if you will, to prevail?
First of all, they are persevering for a long time, and they will probably need to persevere for longer period, because there are no immediate and easy solutions for the situation in Gaza. And I don't think that Hamas is losing. I think that you have to better define what are the goals of Hamas. And the main goal of Hamas is to, on the one hand, keep the level of standard of living in Gaza reasonable in Palestinian terms, and at the same time to maintain the spirit of struggle against Israel, against Zionism. Because if they just wanted to take care of the population of Gaza, the situation could have been much better. But they have to maintain this spirit of struggle. And that's why they have the marches. That's why once in a while they launch an attack with rockets and so on and so forth. The battle goes on. And as long as they keep control of the Gaza Strip and don't cross a certain line that would force Israel to take harsher measures that would threaten their control of Gaza, they are not that worried about the situation. And that's why we keep having it. That's why they keep encouraging the people to launch those balloons and the kites with incendiary capabilities, because that's the way to keep the war going on. And one has to remember, what is this war about from their point of view? From their point of view, this war is about the existence of Israel. This is the March of Return, the great March of Return. So it's about annihilating Israel. That's the consciousness in which they want to keep their people fighting for annihilation of Israel. And they managed to do that. That's the important thing for them. We have, on the other hand, a goal that is extremely complicated. We want, on the one hand, to keep Hamas as an address in Gaza, somebody who's responsible and has the monopoly over the use of force from the Gaza Strip, that we can communicate with, not necessarily in negotiations, but through power or through a third party, and that we shall be able to accept from this address some sort of tranquility as much as we can. And at the same time, we want Hamas, and for that we have to keep Hamas strong to some extent, that they can enforce their will over the other elements in the Gaza Strip. And on the other hand, we want Hamas really weak, so that they won't be able to really cause us a lot of trouble. And this is an equilibrium that is very difficult to keep stable for a long time. From time to time, it moves to some direction, and when it does, we see some sort of escalation. And as a matter of fact, last year is characterized by at least 8 rounds of escalation. That these rounds of escalation serve the interest of Hamas. The point is that on the one hand, we may change our policy if we find out that Hamas is unable to control. And what we've seen, for example, in the last round, was that the organization that initiated the last round was the Islamic Jihad, probably not with the consent of Hamas. And in some cases, it was even initiated by people from within the military wing of Hamas, as they call it, Izzat al-Qassam. So if they cannot control it, then we should have to intervene and maybe put some more pressure. As you said, I'm not sure about incursion, but we can do all kinds of things from the air that we don't always do. Even the last round, we did things that we didn't do before.
Absolutely, and the annihilation of Israel is something that Hamas has never shied away from, something that has also provided it with a popular mandate from the Palestinian public in 2006, when it was elected as the main winner, actually, in the Palestinian national elections. Mr. Oren, when we're looking at the situation at Hamas, and both Colonel Ben-Shalom and General Kuperwasser allude to this point, Hamas has trouble in the Gaza Strip. When we're talking about the Islamic Jihad, it has the full backing of the Islamic Republic of Iran, backed also by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, and is acting on its behalf in the Gaza Strip, of course, with Palestinian national interests of its own. But Hamas, which got elected based on the resistance portfolio, if you will, with its charter quite clearly indicating a call for Jihad, which is the Arabic term for a holy Muslim war, is seeing a contender for this same portfolio. So to what degree is it sustainable within the current circumstances? And even though Israel is more interested in Hamas being in Gaza, as ironic as it might sound, it's less so with regard to the Islamic Jihad.
You brought up several issues rather than one. The Hamas victory at the polls 13 years ago had to do not only with its militant policy, where Fatah, or the Palestinian Authority under Mahmoud Abbas at the time, he took over from Arafat in November of 2014, was more moderate. The problem for Hamas, or for Fatah, which Hamas used, was corruption, was the fact that they were very poor administrators. And therefore, even though Hamas did not get more than 42% of the vote, because of the system of government, it had a majority. Once in power, we have seen several phenomena which are comparable to what happened to Fatah. They are now the establishment, so they are now responsible and accountable. Some of them are also corrupt, and there is resentment within the population. Now, for Israel, a humanitarian crisis in Gaza is a very, very negative development, not only because Israelis care for the poor Palestinians, but also because it could spill over into Israel in various forms. So Israel would like Hamas to take care of the population. One problem for Israel is that we are now marking almost 5 years to Operation Protective Edge. At that time, Israel did not want to go into Gaza by force. There were incursions, there were casualties in some of the maneuvers into Gaza, but it did not go into Gaza in force. And in order to avoid that, Prime Minister Netanyahu and his cabinet came out with what was supposed to be a military secret, that Israel has no interest in doing that. This has become dogma. So now Israel, in fighting a psychological warfare, has to convince the Palestinians that this is not necessarily the case. And therefore, what we have heard over the last several months is that the new chief of staff of the Israeli military, Lieutenant General Aviv Kochavi, is more militant than his predecessor, and that he would have no qualms, and he is going to order an incursion into Gaza. And all of that is intended to let Yahya Sinwar and his colleagues at the Hamas leadership be less sure of Israel's restraint when anything starts. So there are some unknowables here. One factor which we didn't mention up to now is the Egyptian mediation. Egypt is now Israel's closest ally in the region except for Jordan. President Sisi made it public. He needs Israeli assistance not only in the Sinai against the local branch of Daesh, but also on Capitol Hill. If he wants Congress to put pressure on President Trump to help him, or at least not to counterbalance the administration's proposal to help Egypt, Israel is doing a lot of work there. So President Sisi, who is an enemy of the Muslim Brotherhood, and Hamas is an offshoot of the Brotherhood, President Sisi plays an important role in mediating between Israel and Hamas.
Nevertheless, when we're talking about the Gaza Strip, stability is in the interest of all parties involved, especially also Israel and Egypt, which, as Mr. Oren just mentioned, is actively seeking to establish reconciliation between the Palestinian factions, specifically the Western-backed Palestinian Authority, or specifically the PLO for that matter, and the Islamist Hamas organization, something that would create more of a stable environment also in the Gaza Strip as well as in the West Bank, where occasional confrontations between the factions, it's not something that doesn't happen on a regular occasion. But when we're talking about the Gaza Strip, it seems that reconciliation is not really on the table. To what degree do you think that this will serve to actually further ignite the situation, or will it bring about a certain shift of tactics?
I think in this studio, for many times, I've spoken about the reconciliation in the Palestinian arena, and I thought it was a positive thing, certainly for the Palestinians. The truth is now I don't believe it's going to happen. I think the rift there is so huge that in the foreseeable future, there's no chance of that happening. And I don't think that the Egyptians now have a strategic goal of bringing the sides together and unifying one Palestinian Authority. I think their goal is stability. The Gaza Strip is on their doorstep just like it is ours. And by the way, no one can talk about the Gaza Strip and only relate to Israel as far as the siege and control of what's going in, because Egypt is the same. We are both have shared border, the same interests. We collaborate on that on a regular basis. And actually, I think now more goods are coming in and going out through Rafah crossing to Egypt than to Israel. So the days are over we can talk about Israel. But I think Egyptians that are the only broker or the only entity actually involved, who else in the international arena can go into the Gaza Strip and tell Hamas what to do, and they listen. I think it's only the Egyptians, and I think what they're looking for is stability, and also I think they understand the Arab world better than we do, but even I don't believe in this kind of reconciliation anymore. It's very interesting to see how all these actors play out, and Mr. Oren rightfully talked about the Egyptians and the Americans, like what do the Americans have to do with Gaza Strip? Just recently, Ambassador Friedman said something, echoing something of the Israeli leadership about annexing territories in the West Bank, and see even how that bounced off of Gaza now with the March of Return in Gaza, talking about Friedman. I think they're even discussing of having slogans where the people walk to the fence chanting "Shut up, Friedman" or something like that. So you see how it's all connected. But directly to your question, stability. I think stability and prolonging the periods of quiet between the rounds, or as we call it, battle days, I think that's the only thing on our mind right now.
General Kuperwasser, as a long-time intelligence officer in your past credentials, to what degree do you believe that the Islamic Republic is quite invested in what is happening in the Gaza Strip? And to what degree do they control the Palestinian reaction toward Israel in case of a wider conflagration across the region?
Well, first of all, they are deeply involved, and they are those who finance, who train, who give technology that for the production of the rockets and the other weapons. They are extremely deeply involved, and actually on what they call the Quds Day, you could have seen the way Hamas was thanking them and praising them for the support they give them. And of course, Islamic Jihad, Palestinian Islamic Jihad is totally controlled by the Iranians. The difference is, I think in this respect, is that whereas Hamas maintains some sort of independence in their decision-making, the Islamic Jihad is much more reliant on the orders coming from Tehran. That said, I think to some extent what happened in the beginning of last month, beginning of May, was a way for the Islamic Jihad to tell their patrons in Tehran, you know, we can help you, we can cause some damage here, and we can even do it on our own initiative, and bear that in mind because you are under pressure from the Americans, and if you need something in challenging the allies of the Americans like the Israelis, we can do that. And I'm not sure that Hamas was very much informed of that in the beginning, but because Hamas, you have to remember, Hamas is very afraid of a war. And they are not deterred from harassing Israel, but they are deterred from launching a full all-out confrontation that may threaten their ability to control Gaza. And they know that Israel, as Amir said, doesn't want to go there, but they know that at some point they may create a situation where Israel would not have any other alternative but to do that, in spite of its will not to do that, and in spite of the fact that Israel asks itself, and what's going to happen the day after?
Nevertheless, to what degree does the Islamic Jihad influence Hamas's decision-making and vice versa?
To a large extent, because there's a rule in Palestinian use of force. When somebody uses force, you immediately stand next to him. You have his back. And there's no such thing that somebody would use force and somebody would say, how can you do that? Let me take action against you. That's not done.
At least not verbally.
Not verbally, and almost even not in practice. So it's although in practice it does happen from time to time. Indeed. In a very limited and mostly to make the impression that they do something. They don't really do anything. Even if they arrest somebody who misbehaved, a few days later when Israel is not looking, they will let him free. So it's and everybody knows that in advance. So nobody is really afraid of something happening to you because you took the initiative and carried out some operation against the Israelis. And because of that, the most radical element can decide how things will develop, and this is always the case. I want to go back to, if I may, to something you discussed before regarding Egypt. We have to remember the amount of elements involved in Gaza is greater than what meets the eye, because the battle is also about is a reflection of what's happening in the Arab world in general. And the Qataris are there, and the Egyptians don't like the Qatari involvement. But Israel doesn't mind, because if the Qataris are those who are going to bring in the money that will provide the stability that Israel is seeking, Israelis don't care who pays for that. But from the Egyptian point of view, it's not the best solution to have the Qataris. So it's more complicated than just we and the Egyptians cooperating on a joint effort to bring Gaza into a stable condition. The Egyptians have other interests. Israel has more interest than just that. It's a very complicated situation. The Americans are out of it, talking about it. It's not their business. Gaza, they gave up on Gaza. They don't have any connection to anybody who can have an impact there, with the exception of Israel. But and that's where we stand now. It's a complicated situation. The chances of escalation are there, but nobody really has an interest in it. So it's how you manage the situation that is the question, especially, as Amir said, at a time when there is no Israeli government that can really conduct major operations in this context.
There is also the Abu Mazen factor. Yossi Kuperwasser here was one of the most senior Israeli Arafat watchers from 1997 or 8 until
1981.
But during the Oslo process and after Arafat took over the West Bank and until his death in France.
Arafat's death.
Arafat's death, of course. Now, Abu Mazen is also approaching the same fate. No one knows when, and apparently it has an impact on his decision-making process. He doesn't want to do anything significant now. He thinks about his legacy. He wants to have a hand in the succession fight as long as he is able. And for him, even if he were to be offered, and he was, control of Gaza, or at least access to Gaza, he would turn it down. He doesn't want to enter Gaza on Israeli bayonets or on Egyptian bayonets and fight Hamas. And he is waiting in Ramallah or traveling around the world, or especially the Arab world. So Israel has to contend separately with Gaza and the West Bank.
To what degree does Abbas's decision-making right now impact the future generations of his, meaning his loyalists, his children, his extended family? Of course, this in Arab culture is very big when we're talking about that.
Well, you don't see many dynasties outside of the monarchies, except for the Assad family, which has now been in control of Damascus for 50 years already, 49 years. One doesn't see the Abu Mazen, the Abbas family, still being in charge. One of Arafat's nephews, Nasser al-Kidwa, is one of the contenders. There are 4 or 5 major contenders for the succession. But the various contenders plus the security organizations are now trying to ally themselves for the succession fight.
Colonel Ben-Shalom, a couple of weeks ago, the IDF spokesperson's unit released a statement unveiling operation by the Navy's 916th Fleet with regard to 2 Palestinian vessels that sought to smuggle various components that are used in the Islamist Hamas organization's territory for the creation of medium-range missiles, reminding us once again for the reason for the blockade to be there. Nevertheless, even though that happened, there hasn't been extra measures to limit or to apply extra force on the security measures pertaining to the Strip. To what degree does Israel actually battle with the international perception of the blockade being unjust, while at the same time Israel is facing daily with various challenges of smuggling attempts and so on?
I think it's a big struggle that we have and a big frustration that will always be on the Israeli side of not being understood enough. I think what was released by IDF spokesperson was just a speck. It was just they had happened to release that, but it's an ongoing operation, multidimensional, of preventing materials, or even mainly dual-use materials, of going in. And some we stop, some we don't. Some come through Egypt, some are manufactured inside. Bottom line, they refurnished all their stockpile since the last confrontation. They're ready to go. They divert their efforts there. So, I think the Israeli security force is doing a very good job, a very, very complicated job. Also maintaining the humanitarian issue. I was there, by the way, last week. Sick people coming in and out, going to hospital, businessmen in and out, being treated humanely, in respect, but all the time maintaining that security apparatus, because you never know when it's going to erupt.
Unfortunately, this is all the time that we have for today. Next time we'll invite you again, and we'll hope to hear better and greener pastures for the future. But I'd like to thank Colonel Ben-Shalom, Mr. Oren, and General Kuperwasser for being here today. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.